The bullet casing was still warm when Senior Chief Garrett Cole made the comment. It was not a loud comment. It was not meant to carry across the room. But the pre-flight briefing room was small, the walls were bare concrete, and the acoustics did what concrete always does. It carried. "That kid cannot shoot for anything," Cole said to the man beside him, a veteran operator named Dale Pruitt, who had 17 years in the teams, and a face that had stopped registering surprise somewhere around his 8th deployment. Pruitt did not laugh. He did not agree or disagree. He simply looked down at the mission map spread across the table and said nothing, which in that room, among those men, was its own kind of answer. The kid in question was 22-year-old Owen Harper. Owen was standing 6 feet away with his back turned, pretending to study the elevation chart pinned to the wall. He had heard every word. He was good at hearing things people assumed he could not hear, and he was even better at not reacting to them, which was a skill he had developed early and refined through years of being underestimated by people who were older, louder, and more confident than he was. He did not turn around. He did not tighten his jaw or clench his fists or do any of the things that the movies suggest a person does when they have just been insulted in a room full of people who are supposed to be on their side. He simply kept looking at the elevation chart, reading the contour lines, memorizing the gradient drop along the eastern ridge that nobody else in that room had looked at twice. Owen Harper was not a Navy SEAL. That was the important thing to understand about the position he was in. He was a support element, attached to a SEAL team for a compound clearance mission in a mountainous region where the roads ended and the terrain took over. His role was overwatch. His job was to find a position above the objective, stay out of the way, and provide fire support if the primary element ran into serious trouble. He had been given this role because it was the role that required the least integration with the team. It was, in the polite language of operational assignments, a peripheral position. The kind of position given to someone whose presence is required by the mission structure, but whose participation is not entirely welcome. Cole had made that clear from the first day Owen arrived at the forward operating base, not through any single dramatic gesture but through the slow accumulation of small ones. The way he had looked at Owen's qualification scores and then looked at Owen, and then looked back at the scores as if he was waiting for an explanation. The way he had assigned Owen the farthest bunk from the team's common area. The way he briefed the team and then, as an afterthought, turned to Owen and summarized what had just been said, as if Owen had not been present for all of it. Owen had arrived at the base 4 days before the mission with a duffel bag, a rifle he had cleaned 3 times on the transport flight, and 72 hours of self-assigned homework. He had requested every available piece of satellite imagery, every topographic map, every after-action report from the previous 6 months of operations in that specific valley. He had spread them across his bunk every night, cross-referencing, building a picture in his head that was more detailed than anything on any single page. The valley had a shape. Most valleys do, but this one had a particular shape that mattered. A kind of narrow corridor that opened slightly to the east before tightening again around a rocky shelf. On the satellite images, the shelf looked like a natural wall. On the topographic maps, it looked like an elevated firing position. In Owen's head, after 3 nights of staring at both, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like the place he needed to be. Nobody had asked him where he planned to set up his overwatch position. Cole had given him a general sector and told him to find somewhere elevated and stay quiet. That was the full extent of the guidance. Owen had nodded, said yes, Senior Chief, and spent the next 2 days doing calculations that nobody asked him to do, about angles and distances and the specific geometry of the valley at night, when shadows moved differently, and depth perception compressed, and the eastern ridge became something you could mistake for empty space, if you had not already memorized it in daylight. He ran his qualification drills with the team the morning before the mission. This was procedural, standard, required. The range was a flat, open stretch behind the base, windy and dry, the kind of range that rewarded aggressive technique and punished patience. Owen shot the way he always shot, which was not aggressively. He waited between shots in a way that looked hesitant to people watching from a distance. His groups were not perfect. He shot a 91 on a scale where Cole's operators were regularly scoring 97 and above. This was when Cole made his observation to Pruitt. Owen filed it away. That evening, in the last hour before the team staged for departure, Owen went through his pre-mission routine alone, away from the controlled noise of the staging area. He sat on an equipment crate outside the motor pool and went through his gear, piece by piece, with the methodical attention of someone who was not nervous about the mission so much as respectful of it. He checked his optics. He checked his ammunition. He drank 2 cups of water and ate half a protein bar, and thought for a long time about the Eastern Ridge. Cole found him there, near the end of the hour. The senior chief was not the kind of man who delivered speeches or offered reassurance. He was lean and sun-damaged and carried the quiet authority of someone who had been in dangerous places enough times that danger no longer registered on his face the way it did on younger men. He stood in front of Owen for a moment and looked at him the way he had looked at the qualification scores. "You know your sector?" Cole asked. "Yes, Senior Chief," Owen said. "You know what to do if we go loud and you can't raise us on comms? Find the highest ground available and stay on overwatch until you break contact or call for support." Cole looked at him for another moment. He seemed to be deciding something, or perhaps he had already decided and was simply confirming it to himself. "Stay out of the way," he said. "Yes, Senior Chief," Owen said. Cole walked back to the staging area. Owen watched him go. He finished the other half of the protein bar, stood up, and picked up his rifle. The team departed at 2 in the morning under a sky with no moon. The trucks drove without lights for the last 8 kilometers, which was normal for that area and that kind of operation. The road ended at a dry creek bed, and they walked the remaining 3 kilometers on foot, moving slowly and carefully across ground that was hard and rocky and cold, in the way that high-altitude desert is cold at night, which is a cold that has nothing comfortable about it. Owen walked at the rear of the formation, which was where he had been placed, and he looked at the ridgeline above them as they moved. The shapes matched what he had memorized. The eastern shelf was exactly where his calculations had put it, and it was higher than it looked on the images, which meant the sight line from its edge was longer than he had initially estimated. He revised the number in his head as they walked. The compound was 3 kilometers in. It sat at the base of a rocky rise, low stone walls surrounding 3 structures, the kind of construction that was designed to be indistinguishable from the landscape, until you were close enough that the distance no longer mattered. Cole's team had been to compounds like this before. They had a practiced, efficient way of moving toward them that Owen had watched during rehearsals, and had studied the way he studied everything, carefully and completely. At the 1 kilometer mark, Cole raised a fist, and the formation stopped. The team broke into its assault elements. Owen was pointed northeast, toward the ridge, with a single gesture from Cole that communicated everything and nothing simultaneously. Owen moved. He climbed the eastern shelf alone, in the dark, carrying 80 pounds of gear up 40 meters of broken rock without making a sound, which took him 23 minutes and cost him skin on both palms. At the top, he found the edge he had been looking for since the first night he had spent staring at satellite images on his bunk. He settled into position, opened his optics, and began to build his picture of the ground below. The compound was lit in his scope. The team was moving through its final approach, invisible against the rock but present to him as a series of small, careful movements in the shadows below the outer wall. Owen breathed slowly. He scanned left. He scanned right. He scanned the slope on the far side of the compound that ran down toward the dry creek bed from the west. And then he scanned the feature that nobody else had looked at. The narrow fold in the terrain along the western approach, the one that looked on every map like a shallow drainage channel, the one that would be invisible at ground level to anyone moving in from the north, the one that Owen had stared at for 3 nights and finally recognized for what it actually was. It was not a drainage channel. It was a covered approach route, and there were people in it. He counted the movement signatures. He counted again. He pressed his eye harder against the optic and held his breath and counted a 3rd time, because the number he was arriving at was significant, and significant numbers deserved to be counted more than once. He keyed his radio. "Overwatch to lead element," he said. His voice was level. "I have movement in the western drainage. Multiple heat signatures. Looks like a prepared position." There was a pause. Then Cole's voice came back, low and tightly controlled. How many? At least 6, Owen said. Possibly 8. They are set up along the fold from south to north. If you breach the outer wall on the north side, you will be directly in their field of fire. Another pause. Longer this time. Confirm, Cole said. Confirmed, Owen said. They are already in position. This was prepared before we arrived. Below him, he could see the lead element freeze. He could see Cole's silhouette go still, in a way that communicated, even at this distance, that the mission had just become a different mission entirely. Owen kept his optics on the drainage fold and waited. The question was no longer whether there was an ambush waiting for them. There was. The question was what happened next, and how fast, and whether the ground that Owen Harper had spent 3 nights memorizing was going to be the thing that kept those men alive. He had one long-range shot available before the angles closed. He had identified it 4 hours earlier, while he was still sitting on the equipment crate eating half a protein bar, long before anyone had started moving toward anything. He had not mentioned it to anyone, because nobody had asked. He settled the rifle. He waited for the order that he was not sure was going to come. The order did not come the way Owen expected. What came instead was sound. The eastern side of the compound wall went bright with the concentrated flash of a detonator charge, and in the half-second of tactical confusion that followed, the prepared position in the drainage fold opened up all at once. It was not the ambush Cole had been warned about. It was not the ambush anyone had modeled in the briefings, or drawn on the mission map, or rehearsed against on the flat range behind the base, with the wind and the dust, and the 91 on a scale where better men scored higher. It was faster than any of that. Owen had been in live-fire situations before. He had trained for this kind of unraveling, the way a clean operation could come apart in the space of a single second, the way sound and light and movement arrived simultaneously, and the brain, which had been designed for an older and slower world, tried to process all of it at once, and usually failed. He had been trained to expect this failure, and to work through it, which is not the same as not experiencing it. He experienced it. For approximately 2 seconds, Owen Harper was as overwhelmed as any 22-year-old person would be in his position. The ground below him lit up in 3 separate places. The radio went from silence to 3 voices in the space of a breath, each one carrying information that conflicted with the other 2. The drainage fold he had been watching erupted with fire from at least 6 positions, and the team below him was caught in the open approach corridor on the north side of the compound, exactly where he had told Cole they would be. One of those voices on the radio was Cole's. It was not the voice of a man who was afraid. It was the voice of a man who was working very hard, at very high speed, through a set of problems that had suddenly become larger and more complicated than the set he had walked into. It was the voice of a man who was good at his job, and who was in trouble anyway. 2 operators were down in the approach corridor. Owen could see them in his optic. They were not moving the way people move when they are uninjured. The formation had collapsed inward, which was the correct tactical response, but which also meant that the remaining operators were now bunched in a position that offered excellent cover from the eastern wall of the compound, and almost no cover from the drainage fold to the west. The drainage fold was the problem. It had always been the drainage fold. Owen brought his scope back to the fold and ran it along the line of fire signatures, counting heat and muzzle flash, and the specific pattern of suppression that told him which position was controlling the others. There is a logic to a well-prepared ambush, a center of gravity that the other elements rotate around. It is not always the loudest position. It is usually the one with the best angle. He found it in 11 seconds. It was at the southern end of the fold, slightly elevated from the others by a natural rock ledge, and it was firing with a rhythm that the other positions were following. Stop that one. Owen had calculated the night before while sitting on an equipment crate, and you interrupt the coordination. You do not stop the ambush. You create a seam. A seam is not a victory. A seam is a chance. He had one good angle. He had calculated it at 740 meters from his overwatch position to the southern end of the fold, angled slightly downhill to his right, with a crosswind that had been consistent at approximately 8 to 10 knots from the north for the past 40 minutes. He had adjusted his dope when he first settled into position, before the mission went loud, before any of this had started, because he had looked at the fold and known, with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent 3 nights staring at maps, that the fold was the problem, and the southern ledge was the center of it. He had not told anyone this because it had seemed, at the time, like an overreach, a support element pointing at the mission's most dangerous threat, and saying, "I see this. I know where it is. I know how to address it." These were not the words of someone in a peripheral role. They were the words of someone inserting themselves into a plan that was not theirs to make. He had stayed quiet. He was not staying quiet now. The 2 operators in the approach corridor were not moving. Cole's voice on the radio was giving a direction of movement that would take the remaining element away from the compound and toward a covered drainage feature to the north, which was the correct call, and which would also take them directly across 40 meters of ground that was currently receiving fire from the southern ledge. "Overwatch to lead," Owen said. His voice was still level. He did not know how this was possible. "I have a solution on the southern anchor position. I need 30 seconds. Cole's voice came back immediately. "Take it." Owen had been waiting for those 2 words since the moment the operation went loud. He had not known he was waiting for them until they arrived, and when they did, something in him went very quiet. Not calm exactly. Quiet was different from calm. Calm implied the absence of tension. This was tension held so completely still that it became its own kind of silence. He placed the reticle. The wind held. He exhaled slowly, the way he always exhaled, the way that looked hesitant to people watching from a distance, the way that scored 91 on a scale where better men scored higher, the way that was, in fact, the most patient thing he had ever learned to do. He pressed the trigger. The report of his rifle rolled across the valley and came back to him as an echo half a second later, and in the space between the shot and the echo, he was already cycling the bolt, already reacquiring, already reading the change in the pattern below. The southern ledge went quiet. Not immediately. Nothing goes immediately quiet. There is always a moment where the system tries to continue without its center, where the other positions fire a few more rounds by momentum before the absence registers. But the rhythm was gone. The coordination was gone. The other positions in the fold were firing independently now, unsynchronized, which meant they were covering their own confusion rather than suppressing the team below. Cole moved his element. Owen tracked them across the 40 meters of open ground, his scope on the fold, his hand on the trigger, watching the secondary positions react to their own disarray. One of them swung toward the ridgeline where Owen was positioned. He was already shifting his angle. The shot from the fold hit the rock 3 meters to his left and sent stone fragments into the cold air, and Owen did not flinch, which surprised him, because he had expected to flinch. He put 2 controlled rounds into the secondary position that had found his angle. It stopped looking at him. Cole's element reached the covered drainage feature to the north. The 2 injured operators were being moved now, carried by the men who had not been hit, which meant they were alive. Owen kept his scope on the compound, on the fold, on the movement patterns that were changing by the second, as the prepared ambush adapted to having lost its coordination. It was adapting. That was the honest thing about it. The men in the fold were not finished. They were reorganizing with a speed that told Owen they had trained for exactly this kind of disruption, the loss of their anchor position, the break in communication, the need to continue operating in a situation that had stopped going the way it was supposed to go. Owen understood this completely. He was doing the same thing. The radio gave him Cole's updated position, the direction of intended movement, the status of the 2 injured operators. One had taken a round through the upper arm. One had taken fragments across the lower leg from a near miss on the rock beside him. Both were mobile, which changed the tactical picture in a way that mattered. Mobile wounded were a complication. Immobile wounded were a crisis. They were a complication. Owen moved his position. This was not in any plan. There was no briefed secondary overwatch location, no pre-designated fallback position on the ridge. Cole had pointed northeast and told him to find something elevated and stay quiet. Owen had found something elevated. Now he moved along the shelf in a low crawl, 20 meters to the east, to an angle he had also identified 3 nights before while staring at maps, the angle that covered the northern drainage feature where Cole had taken his element. He settled again. The fold's remaining positions were trying to reacquire the team's direction of movement. They had good instincts. They were moving their fire north, which was the correct direction, which meant they had either anticipated Cole's move or they had someone else with a radio who was watching. Owen noted this and set it aside, one thing at a time. He put 3 more rounds into the northern edge of the fold in the space of 12 seconds, not to hit anything specific, but to interrupt the movement of fire. 3 shots, spaced deliberately, targeting the rocks at the top of the fold's lip where anyone trying to reposition and aim north would have to expose themselves. 2 of the 3 rounds connected with something that was not rock, based on the way the movement stopped. The third hit rock and sent a satisfying spray of stone across the fold's upper edge, which accomplished the interruption just as effectively. Cole's element was moving fast now. The injured operators were being supported between the uninjured ones, a clumsy but effective movement that was eating ground toward the extraction route faster than the fold's remaining positions could track. Owen followed them in his scope. He fired twice more at positions that showed themselves. The valley was getting noisier, which was a strange thing to notice, because the valley had been extremely loud for the past several minutes, and the increase in noise was incremental. But there was more fire coming from the direction of the compound now, not from the fold, from the compound itself, which meant that the operation had attracted attention beyond the prepared ambush, and that the window for clean movement was closing. He keyed his radio. Overwatch to lead. You have additional contact developing from the compound, eastern wall. You have approximately 90 seconds before it reaches an angle on your current route. Copy, Cole said. He did not sound winded, which Owen found remarkable under the circumstances. If you move to the dry creek bed now and follow it south for 200 meters, you come out behind the rock feature on the western side of the approach road. The compound contact cannot see that route from the eastern wall. A pause. How do you know that? Cole asked. Maps, Owen said. Another pause. Shorter this time. Moving, Cole said. Owen shifted his scope to the eastern wall of the compound and placed himself between it and the movement below. He fired 3 times at the top of the wall when figures appeared there, not to neutralize, but to discourage, to make the eastern wall an uncomfortable place to stand and aim from, while a team of operators moved through a creek bed 200 meters away. It worked. The figures dropped back behind the wall. Owen moved again along the shelf, tracking his team's movement in the narrow window of his optic, keeping the eastern wall in his peripheral vision, waiting for it to produce another threat that needed addressing. Below him, Cole's element reached the creek bed. They moved south. The eastern wall produced 2 more figures. Owen addressed them. They did not come back. The valley went quieter. Not quiet. Quieter. The fold had stopped producing coordinated fire. The compound was producing sporadic fire in multiple directions, which was the signature of a force that had lost its coordination, that was reacting to a situation rather than controlling it. Sporadic fire in multiple directions is dangerous the way all fire is dangerous, but it is a different kind of danger from coordinated suppression with a prepared anchor position. Owen knew how to work around the first kind. He had just demonstrated this. He began moving east along the shelf, toward the extraction route, keeping low, keeping the valley in his peripheral vision, listening to the radio traffic that was now calmer and more organized, as Cole's element sorted itself into a coherent formation and moved toward the vehicles. The cold was something Owen noticed for the first time since the operation went loud. His hands were cold. His palms were raw from the climb and cold from the night air, and still steady, which he noted with a detachment that surprised him. He had expected, in the abstract way that one expects things before experiencing them, that the steadiness would leave at some point during the past several minutes, and that he would have to work through its absence. It had not left. He thought about this while he moved. He was not sure what it said about him. He was not sure it said anything. Some things were simply true about a person and did not require interpretation. He reached the eastern end of the shelf and began his descent. Below him, The team was in the creek bed and moving. The radio told him they were 300 meters from the vehicles, then 200, then 100. Owen reached the bottom of the shelf and moved toward the rally point at a controlled run, carrying his 80 pounds of gear across cold, rocky ground in the dark, alone, without lights, navigating by the map he had built in his head over 3 nights of staring at images in a room with bad lighting and a cold cup of coffee. He did not get lost. He did not slow down. He reached the vehicles 4 minutes after Cole's element. The debrief happened in the same concrete room where Cole had made his comment about the kid who could not shoot. Cole ran it the way he ran everything, efficiently and without sentiment, working through the sequence of events from the initial approach to the extraction, noting what had worked and what had not, and what needed to change before the next operation. He was thorough. He was precise. He gave the facts the respect they deserved, which in that room, among those men, was the highest form of acknowledgement available. The 2 injured operators were in medical. One was already cleared for limited duty. The other would need 2 weeks. They were alive, which was the number that everything else organized itself around. Cole worked through the timeline. He described the prepared position in the drainage fold. He described the loss of coordination after the anchor position was neutralized. He described the movement through the creek bed and the value of the route intelligence that had been provided in real time during the withdrawal. He did not say Owen's name during any of this. He said Overwatch element. He said the support position. He said the information that was relayed. Owen sat in the back of the room and listened and did not raise his hand to clarify or correct or add detail. He had submitted his full report before the debrief began. Everything Cole was describing was in the report, with precise times and distances, and the specific sequence of shots fired, and their results. The report had been read. The debrief was not the report. The debrief was something else. When Cole finished the timeline, he paused. He looked at the map on the table. He looked up, and his eyes moved to the back of the room where Owen was sitting, and he held that look for a moment that was not long by any objective measure but that had a weight to it that Owen felt in a specific place somewhere behind his sternum. Cole said, "The Overwatch element performed above the requirements of the assigned role." He said it the way he said everything, flatly, precisely, without decoration. Then he moved on. That was the entirety of it. No ceremony. No extended acknowledgement. No reversal of the comment made 24 hours earlier in that same room, 6 feet from where Owen had been standing with his back turned, pretending to read an elevation chart. Owen sat in the back of the room and felt the weight behind his sternum shift into something different. Not satisfaction exactly. Not vindication. Something that did not have a clean name. Something that existed in the space between what he had been told he was and what he had just demonstrated himself to be, and the fact that the distance between those 2 things had been measured in the dark, at 740 meters, in the middle of a valley that he had memorized alone, while the men around him were doing other things. Pruitt, the 17-year veteran who had not laughed at Cole's comment and had not agreed or disagreed, was sitting 2 seats away from Owen. At the end of the debrief, as the room began to organize itself toward its next task, Pruitt stood up and stretched, and looked over at Owen with an expression that was not warm. Exactly, because warmth was not Pruitt's register, but that was something. Present, steady. "Good shooting," Pruitt said. He said it quietly, not for the room, not for anyone else, just the 2 words, aimed at Owen the way a well-placed round is aimed, with precision and without excess. Owen nodded. "Thank you," he said. Pruitt picked up his coffee and walked out. Owen sat alone in the concrete room for a moment, after the others had filed out. He looked at the elevation chart still pinned to the wall, the same one he had been studying when Cole's comment hit the concrete and came back to him. He looked at the contour lines of the eastern ridge, the shelf he had climbed in the dark, the sight line he had identified 3 nights before anyone started moving toward anything. He stood up. He had a rifle to clean. He picked it up and walked out into the dry morning air of the forward operating base, where the sun was coming up over the eastern ridge line and turning the rocks the color of old copper, and he went back to his bunk, which was still the farthest one from the team's common area. and he sat down and began to work through the cleaning process with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. The rifle was clean in 40 minutes. He put it down and looked at the ceiling. He was not sure what he felt. He was not sure the word for it existed in a form that could be spoken without losing something essential. What he knew was this. He had looked at a valley that other people had looked at, and seen what they had not seen. He had done the work that nobody asked him to do. He had been in the right place, at the right angle, at the right moment, and none of that had happened accidentally. None of it had been luck. He closed his eyes. He slept for 6 hours, which was the longest uninterrupted sleep he had managed in 4 days. He did not dream about the valley. 3 weeks later, at a different base in a different region, Owen Harper ran his routine recertification qualification on a flat range with a crosswind. He shot a 93. He said nothing about this. He collected his card, reviewed his groups, made a small mental note about his third round in the second series, which had pulled slightly right, in a way that told him something about his grip on cold mornings, and he went back to his assigned area. Nobody made a comment. Not because nobody noticed. The team had been reshuffled in the weeks since the Valley operation. Some familiar faces were gone. Some new ones had arrived. But the original team, Cole and Pruitt, and the others who had been in that concrete room and in that approach corridor, were still present, still operating, and they were a different kind of quiet around Owen now than they had been before. It was not a dramatic change. It was not a transformation that a film would find satisfying. There was no moment where Cole clapped him on the shoulder and said the thing that undid the earlier comment. Cole was not that kind of man. The teams were not that kind of place. What changed was the way space was shared. Owen was no longer briefed as an afterthought. His Overwatch assessments were reviewed before final route planning, not after. When he made observations about terrain features, they were written down. When he raised a question in a briefing, it was answered with the same directness given to the senior operators. These were small things. But small things, accumulated over time, are the architecture of how a person exists within a group, and the architecture had shifted. Cole came to him the night before their next operation, a different kind of briefing, more complex, more risk. He spread the map on the table in Owen's assigned area, not the main briefing room, and he went through the planned Overwatch positions point by point, asking Owen's read on each one. Owen gave his assessments. He pointed to 3 terrain features that the planned positions could not see. Cole looked at them for a long time. "Which one do you want?" Cole asked. Owen pointed to the one at the northeastern edge of the objective area, the elevated shelf that provided the longest sight line and the worst access route, the hardest one to reach, the one that required the most preparation and the most patience, and the kind of sustained attention that looked, to people observing from a distance, like it might be hesitation. Cole nodded. He rolled up the map. He started to walk away and then stopped, his back to Owen, and stood still for a moment in the way that a person stands still when they are working through something that does not come easily to them. He did not turn around. "That shot in the fold," he said. "That was 700 and something meters. Downhill, crosswind, low light." Owen said nothing. "Dale looked it up," Cole said. "In the after action. He measured it off the grid." Silence. 742, Owen said. Cole was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. He walked out. Owen looked at the map he had been left with, the one now rolled up on his bunk beside his rifle. He unrolled it. He looked at the northeastern shelf. He thought about the approach route, the climb, the angle, the specific variables of wind and distance and gradient that he would need to account for. He thought about the drainage fold in the valley 3 weeks behind him, the 3 nights of staring at images in a room alone, the comment that had carried across concrete and arrived in his ears while he stood with his back turned pretending to read an elevation chart. He thought about the way Cole had said "yeah," that one word, flat and quiet and precisely placed, the way a man places something when he wants it to land without making a speech. Owen looked at the northeastern shelf on the map for a long time. Then he got out a pen and began marking the approach route, noting the gradient, noting the exposed sections, noting where he would need to move fast, and where he would need to move quietly, and where he would need to stop and wait and hold still in the way that some people mistake for hesitation, but is, in fact, the most demanding thing a person can ask of themselves. The patience to do nothing until the moment when doing something is exactly right. He had learned this slowly, over years, in the specific way that a person learns something that nobody taught them directly, through trial and accumulated error, and the long private process of understanding what they were actually good at, and why. He marked the last waypoint on the approach route and looked at the shelf's position relative to the objective. The angle was perfect. He had known it would be. He rolled the map, placed it beside his rifle, and began his pre-mission routine, alone and unhurried, in the way of someone who had long since stopped needing the approval of the room to know what he was worth. The next morning, when the team staged for departure, Owen was ready before anyone else. He was always ready before anyone else. Nobody had started noticing this until recently, but they had started noticing it now. And Owen Harper, 22 years old and 4 deployments from the man he would eventually become, walked to the vehicles in the early morning dark and did not look back at the base, and did not think about the concrete room, and did not replay the comment that had been made in it. He thought about the northeastern shelf. He thought about the wind direction, and the elevation, and the specific quality of pre-dawn light in high-altitude terrain, the way it grayed the rocks and flattened the shadows, and made distances deceptive for anyone who had not already measured them by other means. He had already measured them. He had done this 3 days ago, alone, with a map and a calculator, and the quiet discipline of someone who had decided, at some point he could no longer precisely identify, that the work was the answer to everything. He climbed into the vehicle. The team climbed in around him. The doors closed. They moved out into the dark.